And Robert, you mentioned something about an event where you sort of maybe made a little bit of a scene or said something. I've heard you mention this in maybe another podcast or two. Can you tell us the story, what it was exactly that it reminded me of your story you told me about when you called out Jolly West way back in the 90s at a conference. Is it something
Yeah.
similar to that?
Well, it's not, I wasn't quite as dramatic as then, on that Jolly West one. I was sort of drugged on Prozac, so I was sort of unhinged. But the conference that I went to, what brought me to Greece a year and a half ago, was a conference. There's a revival of the Eleusinian mysteries here, and I bet Joe knows this book, and we may have discussed it. A book that was a big book, a bestseller, a couple years ago, called The Immortality Key, by a man that's become a friend of mine, Brian Murarescu, which is an attempt to sort of, I say, Christianize the Eleusinian mysteries. And Brian wrote this book. He was inspired to write this book by The Road to Eleusis, which is a book that I considered a very important book 20, 30, 40 years ago when I first read it. In fact, I brought it back into print. I edited two subsequent editions. And it's a book that suggests and argues, but doesn't prove, that the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries were based on a psychedelic potion, the kykeon, which provided very powerful visions to the initiates. And this is considered by scholars to be one of the most important religious celebrations of the Western world. It went on for, nobody really knows exactly when it started, but 1,500 years it went on. And it was a very solemn procession from Athens into Elefsina, which is about 15 miles away. And and then on the seventh day, they drank a potion which gave them these visions of life after death. It was a classic death rebirth initiation scenario. And all of the leading figures of the ancient Greek world participated and proclaimed that this was the most important experience of their life. And but it was shrouded in secrecy. The initiates were forbidden to say what actually happened within the rite. And it was so well respected that for all these years, nobody did. There were one or two little episodes that helped scholars. And when I say scholars, I mean especially a man who's a close friend of mine, Carl Ruck, a classicist from Boston University, and Gordon Wasson, one of the most important and not well understood characters of the modern psychedelic movement, the man who kind of started it. And Joe we'll get into this. Wasson and Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, wrote this book, The Road to Eleusis, that said that this was a psychedelic-like potion. I thought this was a very important piece of information at the time. I still do, because it had been well known in contemporary scholarship and drug policy that psychedelic drugs were important to the religious practices of shamanic or traditional societies. And but not much had come out about their use in Western history and Western philosophy. And the Eleusinian mysteries were like the birth of Western philosophy. Plato was an initiate, and Socrates was an initiate, and all these characters. And and so to this conference, I published this book, republished it in a new edition with new material from, the outstanding scholar of religion, Houston Smith, and some other material adding to the thesis. And I did it for legal reasons to try to carve an exemption for the religious use of psychedelic drugs. In the United States, only the Native American church was allowed to use a psychedelic peyote in their ceremony. And so I wanted to just put this information out there. And so it fell on deaf ears when I did this. And then I did another edition, again, deaf ears. But here comes Brian Murarescu in 2008, I think. He saw a copy of the book that I published, and it inspired him to do this research and to link the Eleusinian mysteries with the origins of Christianity. That the Eucharist, in fact, was perhaps derived from the potion at Eleusis. And it was a huge book. CNN did a whole thing, it was a bestseller, New York Times bestseller. He was on all these talk shows, and it was a big deal. So I was invited to Athens to a smaller conference to talk about the Eleusinian mysteries and why I republished that book. And then a couple of days later, I kind of snuck into this grand affair where the something called the World Human Forum and the sister of the prime minister, and there's all this money about this revival of the importance of psychedelics in Western religion and in particularly Christianity. And Brian is the star of this. And so I show up and he gives a very eloquent talk, and I raise my hand. This is actually, there's a longer story because this is how I met my wife. But I raise my hand and I say, my question is, why now? Why, with all due respect, Brian, your book doesn't say anything new. Your book is saying what scholars of this subject have known for 60 or 70 years. But now suddenly, my question is, what's the enterprise behind the publication, and what's really going on here? And that got a lot of people talking. He was a little tongue-tied. He didn't know what to say there, because I want to get right to the heart of it, like what's behind the psychedelic renaissance, and that's one of the things that brought Joe and I together, in our similar interests in these theories and observations and data that we've been able to present to show that this is not really an organic development of scholarly interest or scientific interest, but this is an operation. This is a top-down operation to reintroduce, well, the first time, in the 50s when Wasson started it, and then it kind of went fallow for a while, but then this new movement. What's really going on here? Who is deploying these drugs again in the modern West, and why? That's, I think, a really important question for everybody that's interested in contemporary culture to really answer. So
It's interesting you mentioned Plato and Socrates, Aristotle, all these people that went through the rites of Eleusis. And I just sense this very strong parallel to the 60s and 70s and figures like William Burroughs and Leary and these other people who were philosophers in their own right during that time, and their proximity to, the psychedelic experimentation and MK Ultra and these circles where they were being themselves exposed to, whether it was Burroughs and DMT and peyote and stuff, or Leary and LSD, or Wasson and psilocybin. Uh, do you think that just seems like a very kind of a mirrored thing, with the people that you mentioned in the rites of Eleusis, and who is like pushing these ideas?
yeah. Well, let me just say one thing before Joe jumps in, because I think it's what I want to do, because I've been very involved in this for a long time. And I know, although I never knew William Burroughs, I knew practically all of the most significant characters that were involved in this drama. And I think it's very important that we distinguish them. And like Timothy Leary, who I knew very well, who I did a book on, who I lived with, I knew him for a very long time. His best friend was my mentor for a long time. And I think the way to go about it, instead of talking about the psychedelic movement, is to talk about the different psychedelic movements. Because there's one group of drugs, yes, we can all agree, but there's several different groups of people that are working with them in utterly different ways. And for my purposes, I like to distinguish between the use of psychedelics for I don't know, good reasons, to explore consciousness for their pharmacological value, for their curative effect, for their expansion of consciousness, for the religious effects, versus the use of these drugs as weapons to control consciousness. And as I talk more about this stuff, I say it's really easy for people to see that the history of religion is exactly the same. Like, religion serves two opposite functions in society. It serves to help civilize people with ethical systems and techniques of self-purification and self-knowledge and meditation and yoga and lots of really good stuff in the history of religion. But it's also true that religion is used as to throw fairy dust in the eyes of the population and to control them and to stupefy them. And psychedelic movement is a microcosm of that. It's really the same. And Joe and I sometimes, I think, maybe a little bit different here, and that I don't mean to speak for you, Joe, but let's just put this out, because I still do discern a very great value to the proper use of psychedelic or entheogenic drugs for religious studies and for personal well-being and for creativity and for healing. And I don't see them just all as weapons, but let me just put that out there.
I'm sure you're correct. I think the current moment requires a focus on the other side of it. The way that we can use the expression governments, have weaponized them as part of an overall system of debasement. If you read, chapter 23 of the Authoritarian Personality, you can see that they clearly were going to the governments, an expression, were going to try to basically break down European Christian culture, and this was not being done for benefit. I mean, the camouflage that the group used was fascism. They thought that this was be how they could basically justify propaganda because of the existence of fascism and their claims about the Holocaust. However, it's simply self-evident that they were going to use Eros in all of its facets as a way to dissolve basically historical European culture. And so the hippie, kind of rhythm and blues music and drugs, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the stuff that I was into in the late 60s, were just inserted into culture as a way to accelerate that process. So that's really what my experience with them was, and my generation. We went through this, and now in hindsight, you could see that it was done with malevolence. And in terms of the your obvious point regarding there are beneficial uses of these chemicals for different kinds of spiritual positions. I don't have any, I'm in complete agreement. I would simply say that until the malevolent use of them is completely clarified down to the last individual, I think we should really be skeptical of all of the people who are, like the renaissance of the psychedelic movement that's going on now. The first approach that a citizen should have to that is that this is simply a continuation of the, of the effort that was brought against us in the starting with Wasson, but all the way through the conclusion of that particular phase of it in the late 70s, when these drugs stopped being very popular. At least LSD. But we should look at it in that way right now, because there isn't enough clarity of what happened, and that has to occur for us to really know clearly where we are today. So, I would never contest the ideas you put forward, and know you're righteous in the way that you look to the use of these the drugs, and that of course is one of the things that the governments were aware of when they decided to try to use them in a malevolent way. I mean, if you think of the spiritual aspects and sort of the intense intellectual sort of aspect to how the drugs would be used in the way you're talking about, and then think about my experience at a Grateful Dead concert in the late 60s with the stoned out hippies. I mean, this was not going on at that point. This was mind control. This was the destruction of the kind of European culture. This was being done so that this group wouldn't have families, wouldn't have a focus on a kind of a strong future, economic future. I mean, this was that experience was done with malevolence, and was brought about by malevolence. So today, when I come across people who are I won't bother with the names, but I look at all of them with skepticism. The ones that are being given promotion by the media. I mean, Robert, if you go back to like Wasson and you think about how promoted he was, with his experience, with Maria Sabina, and he's getting this, and the story he wrote in Life magazine where he talks about how this is, we could find God, and the whole thing is a lie. I mean, it's been parsed now by historians that Wasson's experience down there was, not what he was writing about in Life magazine. And then to see Life magazine literally put him on the cover. I mean, and then of course, who is Life magazine? You get into Henry Luce and this whole background. You can see this is just they're just trying to use eros, sex, drugs, and rock and roll to partition the individuals, particularly the baby boomer, this large demographic clump. They want to partition them away from their historical European culture because they want to create the brave new world. I mean, ultimately, this ends up with, Soma and the government in control of education and intellectual stratification. Like I talk about that people think that, Brave New World is some kind of a fantasy. I mean, Huxley was completely connected into the oligarchs, knew the plan. And when you see the autistic being, now in California, there are some statistics indicating it's 1 in 10 children who are males that have some degree of autism. I mean, this is the delta and epsilon class being created in real time, So I bring I just bring this really kind of commitment to skepticism, because I feel that particularly in my particular generation, the people who are 18 years old and thereabouts in 1967, we were so damaged, by what these individuals did, by Leary, by Bateson, by Allen Ginsberg, by the Grateful Dead, by all of these people who are agents of the government, basically, that I really, just because of my background and experience, I just have this really strong skepticism toward the new individuals who are coming forward with the information. And I don't think the public is completely aware of what happened. So I'm still in that process, but this is completely separate from the one that you've talked about. In other words, I would love to be an initiate in the illusion mysteries, if the opportunity was presented to me. Yeah, of course. But as far as the aspect of how these drugs are being used in the, in the modern culture, so-called, I'm just very, very skeptical of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is exactly the point that I think we could hang on for a bit here. And what I want to do, to the extent that I'm going to stay involved in this subject, is help to cultivate discernment between how do we use these substances really for to advance ourselves and our society, and how do we discern when they are being used as weapons? and to really, paint this picture with a finer brush. I mean, to me, it's clearly obvious, just as you said, if and when somebody is, really promoted by the media, we have to understand that the media in advanced industrial society in Britain, in the United States, and Germany, especially, the media is it's not a fair and free press. It's an apparatus. It's a mind control propaganda apparatus. This happened first. My analysis, it begins the course of my life, right? I was born in 1956. And it's happened first kind of slowly with Operation Mockingbird, beginning in the really with the very inception of the CIA in the late 1940s and throughout the 50s, the infiltration of the media, and not just the newspapers, but publishing companies and film, and this essential pillar of democracy, the free press, was knocked out as one of the first operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. And you really have to understand that. These days, now that I'm an expatriate, really looking back at America and with the Trump administration, we're seeing all this stuff in the media about, oh no, we have America's becoming a fascist country now with this dictator, and it's an authoritarian, totalitarian regime. And I'm thinking, with these people born yesterday, I mean, America has been a military dictatorship since, pick a point, with the formation of the CIA, with the National Security Act, which kind of undid the system of checks and balances. You want to go back a little further to the creation of the Federal Reserve, which privatized the money? Do you want to look at the assassination of John Kennedy, which is obviously a completely false story that was just asserted to the American public with almost no pushback? Do you want to look at the Eisenhower's farewell speech, where he said clear as day that if we don't do something about this military industrial apparatus, we've lost our democracy? Kennedy begins to try to do something about that, gets shot in the face in broad daylight, and the country, the world is made to believe he was shot in the back of the head by a guy through some tree. It's like completely preposterous. Or do you want to go to the Iran-Contra thing, where you had, billions of dollars of weapons being sold in cocaine smuggling deals with the CIA, without the auspices of Congress? Do you want to look at 9/11? I mean, America is a joke. It's not, fascism didn't just come to America. It's been a fascist dictatorship for the last 60 something years.
Yeah, I would think that the point that can be sort of understood by the public would be the Civil War. I mean, look at Skull and Bones control over, the individuals, like Jefferson Davis, for example. I mean, they were completely in control of this individual. And so, going forward, look at the New York Times when August Belmont, who was the Rothschilds' financial steward, owned it at its origin with Jerome, who would then became, his daughter became the mother of Winston Churchill, famous Freemason. So the Masonic sort of, control over the United States government is, as you kind of alluded to, is organic. I mean, Washington, when he was inaugurated, was wearing the apron, so the idea that we're a Christian nation or can have Christian political control is an illusion. I mean, we've always been a Masonic, and I would say a Judeo-Masonic is the expression I use. Kind of that has been the strongest political force and has sort of shaped, the foreign policy and domestic policy of the nation. The problem, of course, now is with technology. The oligarchs are able to basically actually execute the kind of biological control that Huxley talked about in Brave New World. I mean, they are getting to the point where they are where they're creating the epsilons and the deltas. And I'm sure to the extent that the autistic, are an indication of the future, I think almost certainly they're going to work the other side of that, and you're going to see hyper intelligence being, manifested in certain groups, because they will have control over, like the genetics to that extent. They've always intended to do this, and so, what is a citizen to do? We really need to promote skepticism. Skepticism is absolutely critical at this point, because if the citizen doesn't develop kind of a more effective toolbox to resist propaganda, we are sunk, because the oligarchs are developing more effective propaganda, to shape our minds. I mean, look at like Facebook and the nudge technology, how AI, for heaven's sakes, where they can just create completely artificial realities. So, I feel that skepticism is the most important thing to promote at this point. Is just uh, rational skepticism, and whatever can be done to promote it should be brought forward, because we are the process by which the brave new world, and what I'm talking about is a technologic Judeo-Masonic um, society, wherein you have stratification of the intellects, and you have control through drugs of mood and behavior and motivation. I mean, we are really moving into that world at this point, in my opinion. And so, um, you have this strange situation in the United States, seemingly strange, where any kind of criticism of Israel is becoming almost terrorism. It seemingly, the way that the people are being criticized for that. If you look at the strange phenomena wherein um, Trump came into power, attacked wokeism, and then the Palestinian people who are supporting the Palestinian situation in Gaza were lumped in with the wokeism. They were part of wokeism, and this was like a bizarre psychological movement idea, because in fact they're completely separate. It's just these are separate ideas, but it was just an example of how effective they can be in terms of shaping our minds. And uh, so it's Robert, it's always like where to start. When you have someone who comes in front of you, you're trying. There's all of these issues. What issues are the ones that really are the most valuable? I mean, is it better to try to simply promote the Socratic method? Is there some value in trying to get them to use psychedelic drugs to like cleanse their mind, or is it better to just go straight at the facts of the oligarchic project and try to get them to rebel? I never know which one is correct. And I think it's almost, to some extent, it's like every person would have one aspect of strength in this area, and that they should just try to find the best way for them, to go forward and to be useful in our present crisis.
Yeah. Noah, did you want to say something?
Well, just Joe, what you mentioned about Trump, and I've found it particularly despicable the way that he will use in speeches and when he's talking the word Palestinian as almost a pejorative, in that he's kind of equated it to these the woke mind virus, these equated to these people that it has absolutely nothing to do with. So I found that particularly despicable. And when you're bringing up New World Order and Soma, I just wanted to share a small anecdotal story about that. I think last time me and you talked, Robert, you mentioned that you had just got back from a Soma holiday, and how the idea of the government having the working class, the plebeians, toiling 5 days a week, and then you have the weekend where you have access to these drugs to take your mind off things and make you feel like everything's all right by the time Monday rolls back around. Well, I
Yeah.
got back. I had my own kind of Soma holiday with some friends a few weeks ago, and this is a very close-knit group of friends. We're all extremely passionate about skepticism and what's going on in Gaza right now and things like that. And this is a part of our normal discourse with each other. We go to protests together and stuff like that. So we went on this trip, and on Saturday, after we had our fungal snacks, I realized the next day that not once during that day was any of that other stuff that we normally talked about a part of the conversation. We were too busy, laughing and looking at the trees and enjoying nature, which is all fine in its own regard. But it goes to show, how effective those kind of tools and psychedelic drugs can be as a method of diversion of energy and attention, you know. And that reminds also talking about kind of this Judeo-Masonic idea and back to the rites of Eleusis we were talking about a little bit earlier. I recently read a book, and I think it may have been on your suggestion, Joe, maybe one of your blogs, called St. Peter's Snow by a
Yeah.
guy, Leo Perutz. I guess he was this
Yeah.
Polish Czech, a very early immigrant to what is now Israel. And the book is really interesting in itself because it almost predicts like so many of these different aspects of the psychedelic movement in MK Ultra. And he's talking about this town using psychedelics on the inhabitants, unbeknownst to them, to push them back to religion, to push them back to the church or to the state, I think it's meant to symbolize.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit more about that book and maybe some of the background to it? Because I like we've already talked about, and Robert, all of these events that you listed, JFK's assassination, the Federal Reserve, 9/11, so many of these things, the players, the people, the motivations, the things that those events helped are all coming from this same, Joe might put it, Judeo-Masonic, Israeli, however you want to put it. But I think that book, St. Peter's Snow, is really fascinating because it was written in 1933. This is like 15 years before MK Ultra really actually took off.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, MK Ultra was just part of the process that had been going on. I mean, for over 1,000 years, I'm sure, in one form or another. But St. Peter's Snow is just a impossibly prescient kind of look into the future and suggests that individuals were aware of of the plan. I think if you look at I always say chapter 23 of the Authoritarian Personality, which was written like 1948, 50. I mean, this also is amazingly prescient. So obviously the plan was, people were aware of the plan. And so the book is just, I mean, I think it's evidence of that. The information that the guy brings out, I think just couldn't possibly have been, kind of imagined. He had to have been aware of it. And I just wanted to make one clarification. It's like people, when I use the expression Judeo-Masonic, it has to be sort of understood. I think in a particular way, the real Judaism, the real post-Enlightenment Judaism was destroyed by the Masonic order. I mean, in 1840, you had Palmerston, who was a Mason, declared that now is the time that the Jews are to return to Israel. 1840. This is 50 years before Herzl and the modern Zionist movement. And of course, Palmerston is overtly a Christian, or certainly not a Jew. He's a member of the British royal families. He was the Prime Minister of England, and everyone in his social class supported him in this effort. And they were opposed by the Jews. You see, Reformed Judaism has developed out of the Enlightenment. And it was the most, in my opinion, humane and advanced religion that we had on the planet in 1840. They had, like with Abraham Geiger, they had created liturgy where they had removed all indications of Zionism. They had taken it out of their prayers because they understood that that was a point in time in the development of Judaism, which it was very defensive, and there was aspects of it that were not righteous in terms of the overall human condition. And that now in the post-Enlightenment world with science and more understanding of nature, we can get rid of this stuff. And Geiger and the Reformed Jews were talking about an ethical monotheism that would bring what was good about Judaism to the world. I mean, imagine how different we would be today as a planet if they had succeeded. But they were the dominant form of Judaism in 1840. The rabbis were completely opposed to this idea that the Masons had, that now is the time for the Jews to return to Israel. But over the next 50 years, because, you know, with the royal family of Britain and all the high-ranking Masons in back of it, they were simply able to buy their way into control over Judaism. And then they inserted Theodore Herzl, who was literally an employee of the British royal family and the Rothschilds. I mean, his first speeches, he was a mentally ill individual. The first speeches are just copies of Disraeli's speeches. Literally, they're like word for word, just copies of them. So he's not even an individual with any sort of agency. He's just a representative of the Masonic vision of the restoration of Israel as they saw it. And so, you know, when you talk about Judeo-Masonic, or if people would say, well, this is an anti-Semitic position, I mean, it's laughable. I mean, the fact is that modern Zionist Judaism is anti-Semitic. It's the thing that really went against the natural Judaism that emerged following the Enlightenment. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, whenever, you know, I become depressed about human nature, I remember that the Reformed Jews were actually describing an ethical monotheism for the entire world. And so when you deal with Zionist Judaism, it's a completely artificial. I mean, it is obviously linked to, you know, the Torah and the Talmud and earlier kind of versions and understanding of Judaism, but it wasn't the one that was real following the Enlightenment. That's something that has been destroyed. So with that in mind, you know, I would just say, looking at, you know, someone like you know, a book like St. Peter's Snow, what you're looking at is just a kind of primitive folkloric, you know, sort of just an understanding of how to control the world. You can see a lot of these things, these aspects would show up if you read the Talmud. You'll see that there's a lot of, you know, sort of indications of this approach. And it formed itself into a secret society, which is not completely clear. Certainly the Masons were part of it. If you look at, you know, Skull and Bones or Bohemian Grove, I mean, they all have a kind of similar DNA, an intellectual DNA. You can see they're all Zionist. I mean, there's not a single person in any of these groups that come out in opposition to Zionism. And they tend to, like, you know, support the Federal Reserve System, you know. So they have a kind of intellectual DNA that runs through the different organizations, at least during the time when they're politically powerful. I think they abandoned the institutions like Bohemian Grove. I don't think is politically active at this point. It's just a dining society. And you know, it's a way of, and I think the Freemasonry may also have been abandoned. I think they've moved certainly into the intelligence agencies. Robert talks about this a lot, like the CIA, you know, the FBI, the OSS during World War II. I think these were agencies that they developed to use, you know, but now who knows? I mean, who they are, or, you know, what organizations we really have to be concerned about. We have to be concerned about everything, unfortunately. You know, they have a lot of political, and they have, unfortunately, they're developing a lot of biological power. You know, you look at how sick we are. You know, the not just autism, but diabetes, obesity, and I think there's just a general decline in intelligence, you know, that's going on. These things are all part of their shaping of the world, and they all have to be resisted. And when you look at something like St. Peter's Snow, you know, it's just a point in the continuum. It's interesting. It helps reveal, the fact that there was awareness before World War II. Dieter Eckart was also someone who was involved in this. And a lot of these individuals will pop up in the kind of precursor to the Nazi Party. They had this, all of the Germanic paganism, which all comes from the Theosophical Society. I wrote an article called The Freemason Invention of the Nazi Party, which is online if anyone's curious about it. And it just shows that our understanding of history, we look at like the Nazi Party and we think, well, the story is it emerged organically from the German people. They were in dire straits and they went to a strong man, and then, all these bad things happened. History doesn't work like this, unfortunately. There are forces shaping it and also describing it after the fact. So when you look at the Nazi Party, you have to look at its origins, and it goes. And when you see how long it was, how long the project was, and my point here is just that then when you put St. Peter's snow into that continuum, you can see that almost all of the kind of historical events that are significant and culture shaping have been brought about by malevolence.
Mm-hmm. I first became aware of that book, St. Peter's Snow, through an analysis by a friend of mine and a very important scholar in this, what do we call this? The psychedelic deconstruction effort. Alan Piper, who is a British cultural historian, wrote a paper called The Mystery of St. Peter's Snow, which he wrote to cast aspersions upon the official story of LSD. Right. So as you said, Noah, the Mystery of St. Peter's Snow was a novel by Leo Perutz, a novel. He was an occultist. It's a novel about the discovery of an agent within ergot that was used in the Eleusinian Mysteries to cause a kind of faux religious revival that was a distraction from the politics of the time. And I think that book, I think you said 1928, or it was
33, I think.
33, yeah.
It predated the discovery of LSD, and now just 10 or so years. And then the book was banned by the Nazis. The St. Peter's Snow was a banned book. And then just 10 or so years later, this legend of LSD's discovery. Albert Hoffman is working and, kind of accidentally discovers this, but it's kind of the same beats. And then over the next, 20 years or so, this is introduced into the culture to create a kind of faux religious revival. And it's I like that phrase that Joe uses, intellectual DNA. You can see this going way back into history, Joe. I think that your work on Caesar's Messiah shows like one of the beginnings of this, like the creation of a religious story that commands a lot of attention and distracts from political developments. But here, this is, I think, important. There was a blowback, like the plan doesn't work entirely well. Like I'm convinced by your research, Joe, and others, than just my common sense, that the Jesus myth is a construction. There was no historical character that walked on water that had divine. It was borrowed and sewn together from various archetypes that go way back, 1,000 or more years before Christ. But there are some principles and some archetypes that became introduced into the culture through the Christ myth that are valid and helpful for genuine transcendence and for bringing about a more sane society. And I think that's true with the psychedelic story too. And I gave a talk on this, ironically, at Albert Hoffman's 100th birthday conference. There was a big conference in Switzerland, and I was asked to give a talk. and it was on I titled it "The Method and Madness of Timothy Leary," because there were a great many social psychologists in the 1950s who were aware that totalitarianism and fascism and authoritarian thinking was beginning to really take root in American society. And there were important experiments. For example, Solomon Asch's conformity experiment, which birthed the field of social psychology, which showed that 75–80% of a population of Ivy League students would rather defy their own senses and conform to a socially constructed reality rather than speak the truth. And that certain social scientists realize this is a recipe for fascism. This is, I'm sorry, this dog is distracting me. I don't know if you can hear it. I live in this little paradise, but we have a very nasty dog that lives next door. What I'm trying to say is that there were several social scientists in the mid 1950s who were aware that the United States was heading toward the same disaster that the United States apparently had defeated in World War II. That people were becoming hyper obedient, conforming to situations that were not true. And one of these psychologists was Frank Barron, who wanted to know what was it about the other 10 or 15% that didn't conform? What was it about the 10 or 15% who didn't obey the authority and shock the subjects in the experiments, right? I'm talking about the Milgram study. What made them different? And so Frank began his whole career like understanding the creative personality and the difference between the authoritarian personality and the creative personality, and found that the people who didn't conform were people who generally had a more positive view of nature. They had an internal locus of control. And then he began to devote himself like, well, how do we make more of them? How do we enliven the trust in one's own capacity to stand against dysfunctional social systems? And it was in that process that he came upon the mushroom. And when he found that mushroom, the psychedelic mushroom in Mexico, he thought this could be the thing. This could be the medicine that could enliven one's own confidence and recognition of the universe is much more mysterious and creative than the social system. And so that's how that psychedelic movement started. And I don't know, I just think that's important to bring out, that these psychological operations that are inflicted on the society can have a blowback and that can be used against the power structure. That's
Yeah, absolutely. The human mind is too plastic and too multifaceted to be pigeonholed in the way that I think the oligarchs, would like easily. In my generation, it's interesting that the individuals who are able to resist the social influence and oligarchic propensities for manipulation were the ones who refused to become hippies. The hippies were the ones who were the most easily, were the ones who were really, they thought that we were doing our own thing. I mean, I was one of them, but in hindsight, the ones who actually stayed within the kind of principles of European culture, they were the ones that actually had the strength to say no to the propaganda. Propaganda is it doesn't work if the individual who's being the victim has no trust. So trust is really the critical part of all of this. And we trusted people like Allen Ginsberg. We didn't look into his background in the CIA or Gregory Bateson or the Grateful Dead or the Beatles. We thought all of this was just you know, a marvelous organic historical event that we were going to take advantage of. And fascism was used as sort of the opposition of it. You know, they were saying that we're going to become this liberated, group. And the historical parallel to this, I hate to say it, is Christianity itself. If you think about the promises of the New Testament, of like Jesus and all of this, and then realize that this was the mind control that was used to implement the feudal system, the Dark Ages. I mean, the feudal system was a 100% Christian project, and Christianity was the central component of it. In fact, if you look at the hierarchical schematics that were drawn during this time and still exist in paintings, the Pope is at the top. The emperor is directly below him, but the Pope is the political and kind of propaganda leader. And Christianity was, just essential to the development of the serf. If you look at Europe in the first century, I mean, Rome was on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it was right there. It was literally ready to transition to, what we developed in the 20th century. Rome had every single thing ready to go. And the oligarchs were well aware of it and used Christianity to snuff out the intellectual light of Europe because it made the people more compliant, and obviously. And so when you came to the Judeo-Masonic use of the program in the 20th century, it was the same playbook, and the hippies were the serfs. They were the ones that they were going to give ideas that would make them compliant, accept their position, and to do their own thing. I mean, the main thing that they wanted to break up is ethnic, coherency, because if you're part of a strong ethnicity, you can say no to an oligarch. What they wanted was individuals. They wanted individuals that had no connection ethnically to any kind of political power. They wanted to break up particularly European ethnicities, the Irish, the Germans, the Italians. They wanted this to be pushed into a multicultural clump, because where the males would be pornographically oriented and the women would be, single moms, because even the family was, of course, very negative to them. They wanted that to go away as well because, you could form ethnicities out of families, and that was what they always wanted to get rid of. And so, I mean, there really isn't a better description of the plan, in my opinion, a better public description than Brave New World. I mean, Huxley was a complete insider to this group, and his kind of fantasy projection of this really gives us our understanding of what they want for our future. And I hate to say it, but this isn't the first time that this program, this literally is just a recreation of Christianity, where the drugs, are Jesus. I mean, and so now we're moving forward into basically a Brave New World, and drugs, pornography, individualism, and then of course they use the idea of racism. They're saying, if you have ethnic pride, if you're European, if you're resisting, for example, the forced immigration that's going on in Europe now, if you're saying, well, we don't want Muslims being introduced into Sweden, well, this is it's racism. So they have this magic expression that helps. It's part of the way that they're breaking down and continuing to break down the thing that they want to see done away with, so they will have no trouble with political power. That once we're down into just isolated units of individuals, and they control the internet. Well, there you have it. So that's why everything that they are trying to promote, put into culture, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Robert. It's just skepticism, right now. And I am not in all opposed. Sometimes people think, that I might be, but I'm not at all opposed to people using psychedelic drugs, particularly if they have the awareness of what it can do to them, as in terms of like how they can think differently about themselves and our future. I don't promote them because I don't have any idea about the individual's ability to use them. You see what I mean? It's not like
Yeah.
there aren't
Oh,
individuals who have very high level spiritualities that can make enormous strides with these things, of course, but to have a general promotion of them the way that like the psychedelic renaissance
right.
so-called is doing now, this reminds me of like what I went through as a teenager at the
Right.
Grateful Dead conference, where you'd have like 10,000 people stoned out on LSD. And I'm telling you, there was no elevated intellect or spirituality whatsoever coming out of this,
Right.
So this is where we are, and it's a difficult position because
Yeah.
on one hand, I'm in complete agreement with Robert, and in fact, hope one day that we can take ayahuasca together, for example. I would actually would be something I would consider doing. But I would never promote ayahuasca to the public. I would always say I'm totally opposed to it.
Yeah.
You need to develop your skepticism. You need to develop the power of the Socratic method. You need to, and also, Bob, a lot of people are not strong enough physically to really make much sense. You see, because they have so much toxicity in them. They're
Yeah.
they're pre-diabetic, they're obese, they don't have the intellectual power of a healthy person.
Yep.
And so for someone like that, I would say, no, eat organic foods and exercise.
Right. 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 Yeah, I like to point out, again, I think it's about making distinctions. I said earlier to cultivate discernment between the right and wrong use of psychedelic drugs. It's also important when we have a conversation about psychedelics is to make it clear whether we're talking about the the history of when you go to divinity school, for example, as I did, you don't just go there to study, you don't just get a PhD in religion. You focus on something. You focus on religion and literature, or the psychology of religion, or the history of religion, or and so with psychedelics, we have to be the same way. Like, make it clear if we're talking about the history of these substances, the sociology of these substances versus the application of them to specific problems. And I strongly agree. This is again part of my interest in the Eleusinian mysteries. You weren't allowed to talk about what happened. I think it's a mistake to talk about your psychedelic experiences. A lot of traditions will say this, in the peyote traditions, like, you don't talk about them because you don't want to create a desire in somebody else. My first book, I tell a Sufi story about this. Like, these are secret traditions, like the Upanishads. The Upanishad, the wonderful Sanskrit word that means to sit near. You sit near your teacher. You learn what is appropriate for you at that time. That there's a container there. What's right for you at one time is not right for you another time, and it might not be right for that other person at that time. So I believe that psychedelics should be kind of shrouded in secrecy. And when the curiosity arises from within a person, there's plenty of information out there. But when you see this whole scale, hyping of the drugs, you're being inundated with propaganda and advertisement from the media, then that's an it's a concerted operation, right? When it's somebody, maybe they're facing a terminal illness, or they're afraid of dying, or they have a snag in their relationship and they need a little boost to get through, then there are plenty of people and a lot of information about the value of psychedelics. But you've got a whole industry created now, and they've put the engines of capitalism onto psychedelics. So you've got people like hanging out their shingle and, come get ketamine and come use MDMA, and people are hyping psychedelics because they need to pay their rent. There's nothing sacred about that. So
Mhm.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because you have you ever met Jay Fikes?
I've never met him actually, and I would really appreciate the chance to meet him. Of course, I've read his work and I've corresponded with him a little bit, but why do you bring him up now?
Well, because he takes the same position. In other words, he wrote Beyond Peyote, and he talks about how he he has been initiated in the Huichol kind of shaman culture, and I think he actually has a kind of legitimate claim to being a shaman, having lived with them for years. But he always insists upon secrecy. He says no, that the real mysteries are individual. You can, and you're not supposed to talk about them.
Right.
Um, he wrote a book which called Beyond Peyote, which I think it's just very interesting to me because a lot of his ideas are so parallel to yours. And incidentally, in the book, he uses a blurb from me
Uh,
on the cover. So if you get a chance to read Beyond
I
Peyote,
don't know that book. Is that a new book of his?
yeah, it's his
Beyond.
latest book, Beyond Peyote, and he
Uh-huh.
goes into kind of a conclusion because he's getting on, and he wanted to write something that would conclude his whole experience with the Huichol. He, of course, is famous for um, being the debunker of Carlos Castaneda,
Right.
and
Yeah.
he
Very
showed that
important.
this was a government project. So it's really interesting, isn't it? Because with Fikes and Castaneda, we actually have real human characters who are, whose lives are kind of explaining in them of themselves the stuff we're talking about in our conversation. I think
Yeah.
Fikes is a
Yep.
completely righteous individual, whereas I think Castaneda was promoted by the government. And so you can see where Castaneda is so public about the experience, and so wanting the culture to accept it, everyone to be normalize the psychedelic drug use for the mass culture. Jay is just the opposite. Isn't this
Yep.
interesting? Jay, who is legitimate, someone who's lived with the Huichol for half of his life. I mean, he is not trying to promote it to the public. He's trying to explain, the steps you have to take as an initiate and what you'd want to do, but never does he talk about the experience or anything like this. And I
Yep.
think this sort of exposes Wasson too, because Wasson, he talks about how this is how you find God through. He doesn't specifically say it, but he alludes to this as this is really why you want to be taking the magic mushroom. So you
But wait,
know,
let me interrupt for a second
sure,
just to add a little wrinkle in here since we're talking about Wasson and Castaneda. Um, that Wasson also debunked Castaneda.
yeah, well,
When Castaneda was coming up, Wasson wrote a piece saying this guy's full of shit. They don't
yeah,
the traditional people don't smoke the mushroom, and Castaneda was just pulling shit out of his ass and writing best-selling books about it. And Wasson sat back and said, no, 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 that's bullshit. That's bullshit. Who is this guy? And so kind of to his credit. I also wanted to
yeah,
insert this in here that there are some of us, and I think I'm one of them, that I just have a bullshit detector. Like way before when I first looked at Castaneda's books and before I was interested in psychedelics at all, and I read these books in college, my first couple of years of college, I just could tell this is crap. It's bullshit. And Allen Ginsberg, when Allen Ginsberg came across my like I couldn't resonate with that guy at all. He didn't seem to be making any sense to me. He seemed like a fraud. He seemed like a degenerate, kind of attention seeking. I didn't get any ring of truth about him. And Timothy Leary, is a much more complicated character to me because I went through several stages in my perception of him. And, just kind of a mercurial guy who was caught up in something. He was used by forces. And then he began to realize that he was being used. He loved the drugs. He loved the ecstatic experience. He loved the attention, but he hated the political agenda behind the MK Ultra project. So he really tried to put another spin on what was going on. And he's a very difficult guy to understand. And And Frank Barron is another guy. Frank, if you read Frank's autobiography and called No Rootless Flower, when the OSS disbanded and became the CIA, Frank was there. He was part of that whole thing, and he realized that something really foul is going on here. And then eventually he caught a grip, and he backed out of it completely and devoted his life to, I think, really genuinely humanistic concerns.
Yeah,
And
I mean, 100%. I can see that as the obvious, truth. The the OSS during World War II employed 3/4 supposedly of all anthropologists on the planet. 3/4. This is documented by David Price in Weaponizing Anthropology, and he goes into Gregory Bateson and
yeah,
shows that Bateson, who of course, famous for Esalen and freedom and LSD and the kind of intellectual support for the hippie. He shows the letters that Bateson wrote as a OSS anthropologist to describe how to create a more effective slave state. It's the most chilling thing I've ever read in my life. And Price has all of this documented in Weaponizing Anthropology.
yep,
And he points out that he goes, Bateson said that to have a better slave state, you needed to create an archaic revival where the people would see their past, their primitive stage, as heroic, and therefore they wouldn't rebel against the technology of the enslaving class. So they would get value from their folkloric and their, the historical ancestral, activities, and then when you think about that, and then think about how they dress the hippies, with cowboy and Indians, David Crosby
yep,
with the buckskin and then the long hair, they had this kind of clear idea about, back to nature, which is, you can see how you can't really parse these things into like black and white components, because I mean, certainly back to nature in the late, 60s is a good idea. It's just it can also be weaponized if it's part of an overall project that they can control, and that certainly is what happened to my generation. And looking back on the attire that I was wearing and everyone else at the Grateful Dead concerts,
yep.
you can really see, man, they were successful with their archaic revival.
Well, that's true. And even Bateson, he's a guy I had very little personal experience with. Um, in the Esalen scene, we really should do this, Joe. I've talked about this. I've been so enjoying my new life out here in Greece that to kind of roll up my sleeves and to get back into some of these issues. But you and I and others have talked about having a conference to really look at some of this stuff in more detail. That book just came out last year about Bateson. Ben Breen at the University of California, who I had many interesting conversations with. And I think even Bateson might be one of these guys that, and I don't know what kind of letters he wrote. If he like had a realized that he was on the wrong track, and if he withdrew from this stuff that he sparked when he was turning Ginsburg on LSD and helping to start the archaic revival and so on. Because in his later years, when I hung out with him a couple times, he's very, he's got very, very into Zen. He was a devoted Zen. He lived at Esalen, but he also lived at Green Gulch up in Marin. And other people that I've talked about this with, that Bateson had a whole change of heart about that. He wasn't really at the end of his life, a promoter of fascism and totalitarian toward the elites. And I don't know that for sure, but
Yeah,
I'd love to.
yeah, this would be a great conference. I would
Yeah,
love to discuss like Bateson in the cybernetic conferences at the Macy, because this is where this is before MK Ultra. And this is where, between the authoritarian personality, where they're saying we're going to organize all of psychology into a way to control mankind through eros, and MK Ultra, and then the hippie. In between the two, you had the Macy Conference, where they brought in all of these anthropologists, but they also brought in the kind of nascent computer people, like gosh, I mean, the names escape me, and they met at this cybernetic conference where they worked out the details of how to code human beings. Newman. So Newman was there with Bateson, and they worked out how to program humans. The computer guys were, already had some ideas on how to do this. And then, of course, anthropologists like Bateson had ideas, and they fused them. And then that organization, the Macy, then had this funding source, the Gesector Fund, which then started funding projects, which eventually becomes MK Ultra. And so it was a very straightforward process. And I would be interested. Yep. And you see, the reason why I'm so suspicious of Bateson, why I would just assume at the end he was just a lifetime actor, not wanting to disclose what he had done, and was still in possession of malevolence, is because if he'd actually had a change of heart, then he would have gone public. I mean, if he'd had that's how I would look at it, is that since there was no elocution of malevolence, he doesn't ever bring it to the public's attention, then even at the end, when he's just kind of an old, happy, kind of hippie hanging out in the hot tub at Esalen, he's still being malevolent because he's not disclosing, to the public what happened.
I agree with you. Yeah. No, I'd like to, he's a guy, I've never gone through his archives. I did go through like Wasson's archives, searching for this to see if Wasson ever did have a change of heart, and I found letters in the Wasson archives where he is pleading with his former banking colleagues, critical of the Vietnam War, and how all you guys are, you're just like, empire builders, and haven't we had enough of that? And there, you may be able to sense a change of heart in Wasson. He didn't ever really come out, as you say, and articulate his malevolence. In my conversation with him, he was still advancing this official story that we now know is untrue. The CIA didn't go behind his back and sneak into that expedition, but he was actually, Alan Dulles had a kind of deferential relationship to Wasson. Wasson was really kind of running the show more than the official story. The official story has him as just like this gentlemanly banker who had this hobby that then, turned into this movement. But he was actually, actively directing it and thwarting Allegro, and, he was kind of the man behind the curtain. We have documents that show that.
Man, I would love to have like a conference, just the Robert Forte conference. You've got so much information that the public should be aware of. It'd be great to find a way just to get it all out. I mean, it's, I'm not sure how to do that, but boy, it would be great to, not just memoirs, but a particular kind, where you bring out these details that you have from personal experience that illuminate, the whole historical process between, like 65 and 80, that critical period when culture was debased. So, I'd love to see a conference like that. And I would like to have at least one of the seminars would be just your, all of these details, these historical facts. And I would, if I'm fantasizing about it, it wouldn't even be something where you'd have questions. It would just be a presentation. You could have a separate one where people could question you but just to give you the opportunity to have like a couple days, where you could get this stuff out, because it would really be valuable to culture to have this recorded and becoming, don't you think? I mean, it'd really be something that would help. We talk about how do we energize the resistance? Well, a lot of that information that you have in your mind and in your experience, that would be one of the ways we could get people to to start to think a little with a little more energy about what is the process we're in the middle of, you know? Yeah.
Well, it's a challenging endeavor because, mostly my first series of books were to advance the right use of psychedelic drugs. So the community of people that's interested in psychedelic drugs, which is now vast community, it's a very popular subject. They're all into it. And I'm like the guy who now is kind of raining on their parade. And I meet a lot of resistance from most people. The community of people that are interested in what I'm saying and what you're saying, Joe, is growing. And there's a kind of rapport going on. And I agree with you. I do feel like it's a social responsibility of mine, and I'm a little bit, I could use a kick in the ass. And a conference like this, there's another guy that I've been in correspondence with a lot who was a kind of major, uh, did philanthropy for the psychedelic movement, was involved with the early MAP stuff, was a volunteer at the Johns Hopkins Project, really interesting, brilliant fellow our age, who also has realized, whoa, 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 there's a whole nother layer to this. He produced a really great film on the medical use of psilocybin, and he's I think we should set up a three-way. And these conferences could be very easy to do, like a Zoom conference like this, and we could have 6 or 8 faces up there. We don't have to fly to some Greek island and do it, although that wouldn't be
That
too
sounds
bad.
more fun.
Count me in.
Who is the individual you're talking about there, Robert?
Well, his name is Robert Barnhart. And he's become a very good friend of mine, even though I've never actually met him in the flesh. But we've been talking about stuff like this for a long time. Like I said, he was a very, very intelligent man, religious studies degree from Emory, which is another one of these, prestigious schools in the United States that's just thick with intelligence money, where there is also a big psychedelic program going on there. But he went to Emory and was part of the whole scene, the Dead and all that, and then began to realize that there was another layer to this, that there was a top-down manipulation, and he felt exploited, and has been urging me. In fact, he wants to set up a whole podcast program with me interviewing guests, and that might congeal here pretty soon. I just got a text from him the other day. He's into astrology, saying the planets are moving, for this kind of perspective to come out more.
Yeah, you should. That would be a great, show. I mean, and I'd love to see if you could get some of the characters that are still around to come on and discuss it with you. The ones that are still with us. They're dropping a bit like flies. So it's a good time to do some, historical documentation.
I'm really interested to see something like either of you talking to like a Rick Doblin type of character, someone who's on the total opposite side of it than we are, because I haven't really seen anything like that. I've never seen a debate, with someone who's involved in the current psychedelic, resurgence, in someone who was, like you, Robert, who really had a lot to do with the initial psychedelic renaissance, maybe, like I think that could be interesting because I feel like a person like Doblin has a vested interest in hiding what you have to say.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
you blipped out when you mentioned the name. What name?
Rick Doblin, I was just throwing that one out.
Yeah, no, Rick would never talk to me
Hmm.
on the air.
yeah. I mean, there's no way. I mean, it's a great idea, but it won't happen because they're so careful about using debates as propaganda.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
someone who would be, an authentic critic, there's just absolutely no chance they would ever, permit that individual to, have some connection to a person that was
Hmm.
publicly connected into the project, because they know that could have, negative effects for them. So
yeah,
what they do is they set up straw man debates where they'll carefully
right.
select someone to represent, the opposition, and that person will be easy to debunk and have bad information. They wouldn't put Robert or me, into that situation. They just wouldn't do it. But
I,
that's why we should always put out say, hey, we're completely open, love to have a discussion if such an individual wants to come forward. I've had a few of these kinds of debates set up, but they never come to fruition. 3 or 4 times where we're almost ready to go, and then at the last second they go, well, we can't do it for some reason. So I feel that there is a kind of organizational filtration process where they do have control at some level, and when they see these things coming into existence and they realize that could be negative for the project, then they just stop them. I don't think they'd ever let Robert discuss with any of these individuals, but which is why we have to do it on our own. We can't sit back and wait to be asked. They'll never ask. They will hope that we pass on into eternity, and information goes with us. So we need to set these things up ourselves.
yeah, I agree with you, Noah. And there doesn't have to be a debate. It can also be a dialogue. And I
Yeah.
think that there are a number of, I'll just say truth-centered versus institution-centered
Mhm.
people out there. And I've also experienced that, Joe. I was invited, Harvard has got this big program now on psychedelics, and I went to a couple of their events and connected with some people there. And one of the people involved in the program said, we would love to get you involved in this. And maybe would you teach a course here or do a thing? And then some of the graduate students invited me to come to lead a seminar. And I got there, and I was very shocked. I was escorted off the Harvard campus. I was told I wasn't allowed to be there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
there it is.
Really?
Because and the
yeah,
fact that someone with
wow.
your background, which is really, I mean, frankly, preeminent, right? I mean, who would be obviously more knowledgeable than you in the history of that era? And I mean, there isn't anyone really who would be obviously more knowledgeable. Therefore, you should always be included in these seminars and given some kind of a teaching role, right? Because so many others have less qualifications. The fact that you don't and you never are invited indicates the organization has kind of a malevolent control over all these things. And I think it's frankly self-evident at this point, that they control the universities. They have a lot of control over the mainstream media, and so like the heck with it, forget them. It's just not going to happen. In fact, I think it's a waste of time, and I won't even waste my time. I mean, I get involved all the time in like show business opportunities, like making a
Mhm.
movie out of Caesar's Messiah or something. I don't waste my time with that stuff because I know it doesn't go anywhere. It's just a way to enter to
Right.
uh, to waste energy. So it's
Mhm.
much more productive. I mean, it'd be much more productive for us to like try to set up our own seminar. And you're right, it's a great idea. It could be just done online. We don't have to like all fly into
Yep.
a university someplace in the Midwest. We can just do it online and then steadily build up the audience that way. So it's a great idea.
Well, speaking of this like institutional filtration, where they control what's out there, the information. I don't know if you had a chance to watch the Netflix Errol Morris adaptation of Tom O'Neill's book, The Chaos Book. Did you guys either have a chance to see that?
Oh, I did see that. Yes.
Well, I mean, it was basically he ends it by saying that he doesn't believe O'Neill's theories, and he barely includes any of the really pertinent information from the book. So it's just an obvious, I don't know if smear job is the right word or whatnot, but a character
Yeah.
like Errol Morris, I don't know if either of you are familiar with his son Hamilton Morris and
Yeah.
his work with the Vice Company. He's been putting out these drug promoting videos, documentaries for like a decade now, where Hamilton Morris goes around the world and tries, toad peyote or whatever. I mean, very, very clearly a poster
Mhm.
child for like the modern incarnation of MK Ultra, in my opinion. So you have
Mhm.
his father then taking this extremely important work on exposing MK Ultra and
Mhm.
just, shitting on it essentially.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that was a very interesting example. I have a little experience with those guys too. Not so much. Well, one day a few years ago, I was still in California. Um, Errol Morris calls me up and says, "I want to make a Timothy Leary movie, and I understand you're the guy." And we were on the phone for like 2 hours going through all these perspectives that I have and experience.
And were
And
you sharing the parts of this perspective, like the, the untold part of it, I guess you would say?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity. I quickly did a little. I got a phone call actually from his son saying, "My father wants to talk to you. Will you be available on Thursday?" So I had a couple of days and I watched his movies, and I realized there's something funny about this guy, that he has a way of telling a story without really telling the story.
Mhm.
He had done that. He had done that whole episode on Wormwood also, right, where
Frank
he did it
Olson. Yeah.
on Olson and didn't really get into to me, the real substance of it. And anyway, I had a lovely conversation with him. Of course, I was very forthcoming with my conspiracy theories, so to speak. And and then he said, "Well, where do we go from here?" And I said, "Well, write me a check, and I'll be your consultant, and we'll do this." And then I never heard from him. And then very quick, like within a year, he had produced a film, and it was about Joanna,
Hmm.
one of Tim's wives, sort of, not exactly, but a relationship that was not really a very significant part of his life. But that was my first sort of glimpse of personal experience with Morris. And then I had some words with his son, and I totally agree with your assessment. He's an operative in
Yes.
drugging society. That's his role. And a lot of people, the psychedelic community is vast and also not homogenous, because there are a lot of people that are more like me that appreciate these drugs for their sacred uses and look at that like, oh no, this is just shameful and degenerate. Um, and then when I saw the Chaos movie, it's the same thing. I mean, he made a documentary about a book to discredit it.
Yeah.
Right? How often do you see that?
Yeah, if you'll notice, Tom has not done any promotion for it, and in fact, he's shared some articles that were very critical of it and saying, "If you want my opinion, go read this article." And even
Uh,
the movie about Joanna, it gets so close to some of the important things, but then it just veers off in a totally different direction and ultimately wastes your time, you know.
Yeah, and
yeah.
one thing I don't like about interacting with these people, the promoters of mainstream, kind of access, is because they waste your time, but they take information from you and learn how to basically be more effective in their destruction of your position. They're always finding through conversations with you, which you think are actually leading to some kind of movie deal, but what they're really doing is just probing for weakness and you know um,
hmm
um, and then being prepared in case you try to do it on your own or something, to be able to debunk it and criticize it and things like that. The people within the anyone who has some kind of power within the media, my position is they're promoted, by Satan. I mean, I know that's a kind of broad stroke idea, but I mean they're malevolent. They're not there talking to you because they've had some legitimate interest in your work or in you. They're trying to probe to see what you have, and then you'll later on you'll see how they've come up with a way to diminish what you're trying to do. They're a vast army. They really have lots of people who
Yeah,
are
they
what
do.
I would call
Mhm.
lifetime actors. Who are, I mean, if you just think of like like a CIA spook, I mean, all CIA spooks have hidden identities. Every one. They can't come out and say, "Well, I'm a spy for the CIA." That would not be the job description that they can give and have any effective, you know, role to play. So they have fake identities, and this is what you're dealing with. And by that I simply mean they're not disclosing everything about themselves, their real motivation. I mean, you can have people that are completely fake, and then others that are just have aspects that will, they're that but in general, it's just a waste of time The more famous someone is who's contacting you and wanting to, it's just more of a wait. The more time you're wasting. So it's much better just to do it on our own and develop our own media.
And leave a record for future generations.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I am writing this book. I work on it a little bit every day. My book, I'm calling it The Altered States of America, Psychedelic Movements of the 20th and 21st Century. That's kind of memoirish, but also an analysis about my own personal realizations and transformations based on information that I received. And I think it'll be useful. So it also brings up, I wanted to just put this out because one of the things I learned early on in my career as a scholar of religion is this concept of two here. One is the Kali Yuga, this idea that the Hindu cosmology, that there are these ages that are hundreds of thousands of years long. And we're in a period of the Kali Yuga, which is an age of deception and false adharma, false truths, not truth. And it's sort of related to this notion in Buddhist theology, in Theravadan Buddhist theology, of the first noble truth, that this is a realm of suffering. It's a realm of it's unsatisfactory. That doesn't ever change. This is where we're in. This is the realm that we're in. We can't change it. It's a motivation, however, for our liberation. And this is I noticed this in my life because I was first interested in Buddhism, and that's what led me into psychedelics. And the idea that we're not really going to improve society, but we can liberate ourselves from it. And now, as I've gotten more and more into the history of the United States, and as I said at the beginning of this conversation, how I've no hope for a political solution to any of these problems. Joe has pointed out in our conversation, they're hundreds of years old or thousands of years old, where oligarchs and tyrants have exercised this domination over our society. We're never going to beat them. But what we can do is work on our own, and these are the last words of the Buddha, to work out your own salvation and to exemplify a life that has liberated itself from these structures and from these false truths that are asserted on them. So I think about this in my own life because I really live in a kind of heaven realm with an amazing partner that I've met a few years ago, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And when I sit down to write and get into these subjects of the deceptions and mind control and these conspiracies and Satanism, they trigger me. And I say to myself, like, why do I even want to bother with these guys anymore? Like, it just it weighs me down. I can go on a bike ride and I can celebrate and enjoy, nature and the beautiful people around me. And I say this to some people, like, let's not fight with them anymore. Just like let go, create our own little, I call them sane asylums, permaculture communities. There's not that much time left in our human life. Why toil with this lower kind of energy? Just go and celebrate your life.
I agree with you a lot to some extent. We're talking about like the Kali Yuga and the Buddhist aspect of it and this individual thing, but even that I feel like can be weaponized, like Ayn Rand, radical individualism, or Aleister Crowley's, Ion of Horus and Do What Thou Wilt, and all these individualist centered, philosophies. Even those can be kind of weaponized too and put you in your own silo. And like Joe's talking about, that ultimately, like the goal of the Grateful Dead and LSD and all this stuff was to create individuals, not family units, and destroy ethnicity that way. So
yeah, I think there's no contradiction. I think that what Robert describes ends up with a more public Socratic method, which ends up in ethnicity and shared interests and in the clarity of mind will end up resisting, the oligarchs' malevolence. I would go so far to say, if you don't have that kind of energizing and strengthening aspect in your own life, you won't have the power to be able to do much. I mean, I don't know if Robert has had the experience, but I'm just meeting so many people these days that the thing if I can give them any advice, it's to, like, eat organic food.
Exactly.
I mean, they're just so ill, so feeble. Their energies are so weak. They're so prone to cancer and diabetes and all of the industrial diseases. That they don't have any capacity to resist. So I think that you have to have the kind of energizing components in your life to have enough strength to even contemplate, doing something useful. I mean, look how old all of the real, kind of wicked oligarchs live to. They all live to be 100. So they're just into a different kind of health structure than we have. So yeah, no, just be healthy and try to develop that the world that Robert says that you can live within. And what will happen is that then the natural kind of communication that's possible with such individuals will start to just build up. I mean, it's righteousness can't help but to compound itself. It's inevitable. So, when you have a great day, you're on your way to to defeating the oligarchs. Just have the great day, use it as energizing, and you'll see people want to be around you. I mean, one thing, personally, I would say, I would be a lot more effective if I had a lot of kind of spirit that Robert's talking about, because I'm just such a miserable person that very few people want to be around me for very long, and so this is a problem, it's an absolutely required first step. Again, it's like when we do the Robert Forte seminar, we'll get into this, like how to actually have a day that is valuable. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that I actually, I don't know what you think about this, Robert. The first thing I say, I go, look, you're interested in rebelling, you don't want to succumb. Start with your body. Start with your health, your strength, start there. This is where the rebellion begins.
Exactly.
They've been attacking us for thousands of years, and we're mentally feeble. We don't know how to think. Try to think better, but also try to manifest. Try to actually have a great day. When you are miserable and when you are isolated, this is their success.
Right.
This is their success. They have defeated you. Forget that. Have a day where you are really connecting to nature in a positive way, and your body's getting stronger, and your mind's getting clear, and you're having fun. Start there. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. I can relate to that, because when I first got in, I was in a pretty serious depression, 20 something years ago, when 9/11 happened and stuff with my family, and I realized what was going on. But it was making me miserable, and I didn't want to share my misery, so I
Yeah,
just kind of
exactly.
pulled. Then things changed in my life, and I kind of worked through it. And I feel like I can share this information with a feeling of transcendence and an ability to exemplify freedom from it. And Joe, I don't think of you as miserable at all. My many visits to your house with Eliza, we were, there's you're one of the sane asylums. You're one of the clearest thinking, and you have the courage to really go down into these places and just look at it with your eyes open, pretty unfazed.
Yeah, and I
That
was being kind of facetious. Actually, I regard myself as just absolutely blessed, and I'm very happy, and
Yeah,
I'm never depressed, and in fact, it drives people crazy. They think it's like, well, how come you're not miserable? I go, are you kidding? Everything that I have ever learned shows me that my ability to enjoy this day is the rebellion I want to make.
exactly.
And people have a hard time with me just because I'm so honest. And this is the whole problem. I mean, I don't really shy away from issues that are unpleasant for a lot of people to talk about. The problem, Robert, is that they're not unpleasant for me. I don't have any problem. And the idea that, like the debate, they go, oh, well, it'd be miserable for you to like, I mean, are you kidding me? It'd be so much fun if these guys would actually show up at the seminar and want to talk to us. I mean, it'd be fantastic, bring them on. Let's have a real discussion about malevolence and righteousness, and which side of the fence, if it's possible, are people standing on? What are the people who are promoting the psychedelics now? What's in back of them? I know some are just as evil as rattlesnakes, and others I think are probably very legitimate and have beautiful hearts, So, but we need to discuss both of them, both classes.
Yep.
All right, guys, I got to run. I have to go, and otherwise my lovely wife will start to wonder why I'm not doing the chores. Robert, let's talk soon. And Noah, I hope we can talk again soon as well, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much.
I'm going to bring Robert Barnhart into this circle here and get some of his reflections. If we want to meet again, cool. I'm available for that.
Yeah,
Joe, give your beautiful wife.
Always love
beautiful wife, my love.
Yeah. Elisa's right over here, so I'll say hi to her.
Okay.
All right, Robert, say hi to Apasilia, okay?
Okay.
Bye, Noah.
Okay. God bless you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.